We wander in the darkness. The truth is right before us.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating, highly detailed theological framework from a text titled Israel's Blindness. This source material is basically a comprehensive King James Version Bible study, and it maps out a very distinct dispensationalist interpretation of biblical prophecy. We're going to be looking at 2,000 years of history, the current state of modern Orthodox Judaism, and a proposed timeline for future prophetic events. Now, whether you're already deeply familiar with this specific brand of theology, or you're hearing about it for the absolute first time, our goal today is to neutrally map out exactly what this study claims, step by step, using the author's own framework. So let's jump right in. Okay, to start, we have to look at what might just be the most provocative, jaw-dropping claim made in this entire text. We're going to explore this in much more detail a bit later, but the study essentially argues that millions of heartfelt prayers are currently being directed at a physical structure that isn't Jewish at all. It's Roman. It's a really striking premise, and it sits right at the center of the author's argument about this long-standing structural spiritual deception. Let's look at exactly how the author builds the case for this and ultimately where it supposedly leads. To make sense of this whole framework, we're going to follow the author's 5 prophetic eras. First, the mystery of blindness. Second, tradition replaces truth. Third, the Western Wall deception. Fourth, the coming false Messiah. And finally, ultimate salvation. Section 1. The mystery of blindness. Divine origins and judicial acts. So the study's central thesis begins right here, arguing that Israel's current spiritual condition isn't just some random historical accident or a cultural evolution over time. Instead, the author firmly posits that it's a divinely imposed judicial act. The text points directly to the Greek word porosis, which means a hardening or a callousing. Now, the author is super careful to explain that this does not mean a total, complete destruction of spiritual sight. Think of it more like a thick callus on a worker's hand that blocks physical sensation. The study argues this blindness is partial and it's temporary. It prevents normal spiritual perception from penetrating the surface, but it's not entirely blinding every single individual on a personal level. And this brings us to an absolutely crucial piece of evidence the author uses to back this up. Quoting Romans 11:25, the study emphasizes the phrase, "Blindness in part is happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles become in." You see, the author interprets that until as a definitive expiration date. It is a strictly bounded judgment. The study strongly insists that God has not permanently abandoned or replaced Israel. That's a theological concept known as supersessionism, which this author completely explicitly rejects. Instead, the spiritual blindness is being held in a kind of judicial suspension until a very specific prophetic clock finally runs out. To explain exactly how God operates this way, the study draws a fascinating, direct parallel back to the Old Testament. The author compares Israel's first-century hardening to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart back in the book of Exodus. The sequence of events is vital here. The text points out that Pharaoh actually hardened his own heart first, and only then did God judicially confirm that human choice. In perfect symmetry, the study argues that first-century Israel was presented with absolutely undeniable evidence of the Messiah, yet the leadership chose to reject it. Consequently, God locked in that human choice with a divine judicial blindness. Section 2. Tradition replaces the truth. From Pharisees to modern orthodoxy. Now, according to the author, the original architects of this historical blindness were the first-century Pharisees. Their primary spiritual crime, the text argues, was taking the pure, direct word of God and endlessly layering it with elaborate human-made traditions. The study claims that by elevating these rabbinic traditions, which eventually evolved into the Talmud and the Mishnah, above the written scriptures, those leaders functionally canceled out the original divine revelation. They made it completely inaccessible to ordinary, everyday people. In practice, the author argues that these religious leaders effectively took away the key of knowledge by actively suppressing or reinterpreting clear messianic prophecies. For example, the study claims that Isaiah 53's famous suffering servant is reinterpreted by rabbinic tradition to mean the nation of Israel as a whole, rather than one individual Messiah. Psalm 22's description of piercing That's directed entirely away from the crucifixion. The text sees this as a deliberate locking of the door, actively preventing Jewish readers from seeing Jesus in their very own scriptures. This study then takes this harsh verdict from the Gospel of Matthew and applies it directly to modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Judaism today. The author argues that today's modern rabbinical establishment is the direct institutional and theological successor to those first-century Pharisees. But keeping strict control over marriage, conversion, and education in the modern state of Israel, the text claims these blind leaders are actively enforcing this 2,000-year-old judicial blindness upon the modern populace. They're basically ensuring there's a barrier against any exposure to the prophetic evidence of the New Testament. Section 3. The Western Wall Deception, Praying to Rome. All right, this is where the theological framework intersects directly with modern archaeology. And it is wild. The crucial point the author hinges this entire argument on is a highly literal interpretation of Jesus' words in Matthew 24. When looking at the temple buildings, Jesus prophesied that there shall not be left here one stone upon another. Now, the study argues this wasn't an exaggeration. It was an absolute, unconditional prophecy that was meticulously, literally fulfilled in 70 AD when the Roman general Titus completely leveled Jerusalem. Supposedly, they even plowed over the entire temple site. If that prophecy is taken literally, just as the author insists it absolutely must be, well then the conclusion is stark. The mainstream view, as you probably know, is that the Western Wall, or the Kotel, is the very last surviving retaining wall of the Jewish Second Temple. But the study argues that if not one single stone was left upon another, the Western Wall absolutely cannot be part of the temple complex. It's impossible. Instead, the author asserts it is actually the western retaining wall of the Antonia Fortress, which was a massive Roman military installation that sat right adjacent to the Temple Mount. The implications of this, according to the text, are spiritually devastating. The study frames this as perhaps the greatest religious deception in modern Israel. It argues that millions of Jewish people are unknowingly praying to Rome and not the Jewish Second Temple at all. They are weeping, swaying, and pressing heartfelt notes into the very stones of the Roman military empire that slaughtered their ancestors and destroyed their city. The author sees this as a profound tragedy, a tragic substitution. They are replacing a genuine living relationship with God with a geographic fixation on a physical Roman structure, basically institutionalizing their mourning into a permanent state of spiritual blindness. To really underscore how severe this is in the study's theological framework, the author brings in the Hebrew word toba, which means an abomination. It's something viscerally repulsive. Drawing directly from the prophet Isaiah, the text argues that performing all these elaborate religious rituals, maintaining strict diets, and praying fervently at this Roman wall, while simultaneously rejecting the true Messiah, is viewed by God as an empty, repulsive performance, completely divorced from true spiritual reality. Section 4. The Coming False Messiah, Israel's Most Dangerous Hour. So all of this historical blindness is building toward a highly specific, very dangerous future event. The text points out that rabbinic tradition has spent 2 millennia crafting a very specific profile for the Messiah they are currently waiting for. They expect a strictly human, non-divine descendant of King David. He has to be a political genius and a military conqueror who gathers the diaspora, brokers universal peace, and, crucially, rebuilds the temple in Jerusalem. The author argues that because this rabbinical profile completely rejects the divine nature, incarnation, and resurrection of Jesus, it perfectly, tragically primes the entire nation to accept an absolute impostor. The study highlights a really stark contrast in the movement of these two figures. The true Messiah, according to the text, descended from above, from God to man, coming in the Father's name. The false Messiah, however, is going to ascend from below. Rising out of earthly politics, human achievement, and military success, he will come in his own name, eventually exalting himself above God. The text argues that Israel's institutional blindness leaves them with zero theological immune system to recognize this massive deception until it's too late. The author then lays out this timeline based on Daniel's 70th week. It goes like this. The Antichrist arrives, brokers a historic peace covenant, and actually facilitates the rebuilding of that third temple, which of course Orthodox Judaism will celebrate as the ultimate, undeniable messianic sign. But right at the midpoint, the text claims he will suddenly desecrate this very temple, the abomination of desolation. This will plunge Israel into what the prophet Jeremiah calls the time of Jacob's trouble. It's a period of unprecedented, horrific national suffering, designed by God as a final refining fire. Section 5. Israel's ultimate salvation, the lifting of the blindness. Now, despite the really grim predictions of this tribulation period, the study insists the story absolutely does not end in destruction. It is, however, a very somber transition. The author points to the prophet Zechariah interpreting chapter 13 to predict that 2/3 of the population of Israel will tragically be cut off during this great tribulation. But the remaining 1/3 will be brought through the fire. The text views this unimaginable suffering as the very furnace required to finally, permanently burn away the 2,000-year-old rabbinical traditions and that institutional blindness that no amount of peaceful preaching could ever penetrate. And then comes the shattering moment of national recognition. Quoting Zechariah 12:10, the study envisions the exact, specific moment the blindness is permanently removed. The returning God of Israel speaks in the first person, saying they will look upon me, whom they have pierced. The text argues this is the exact moment the surviving remnant suddenly realizes that the God they have been seeking all this time and the crucified Jesus of Nazareth are actually one and the same. It results in a national mourning of ultimate, intimate grief. This all culminates in the triumphant conclusion drawn from Romans 11, and so all Israel shall be saved. The study is adamant that God's original covenant with Abraham is entirely irrevocable. The 2 millennia of judicial blindness, the author argues, was merely a parenthesis in history, a pause that allowed the gospel to go out to the Gentiles. But at the second coming, that blindness is instantly, completely, and permanently eradicated, resulting in the glorious, full national restoration of Israel. So, what is the ultimate takeaway for you, the reader? The study concludes that the only legitimate response to understanding this heavy timeline is profound grace. The author points right to the Apostle Paul, who carried unceasing sorrow and true anguish for his people. It's a call to entirely reject theological arrogance and instead embrace deep, authentic compassion. But looking at this deeply intricate framework, reconciling a tragic 2,000-year history, a highly controversial view of sacred geography, and a dramatic future climax, we really have to ask, how does understanding this timeline reshape the way you view the events unfolding in the Middle East today?